The sample room is cool before dawn, and the wheat dust on the work table carries a faint, dry sweetness. Outside, somewhere beyond the wall, a rail car settles with a soft metallic knock in the Omaha yard. You stand where almost no one ever thinks to look, between the elevator house and the freight tracks, in a plain room with probes, sieves, scales, grade cards, and small cloth sacks laid out in their usual order. Nothing here is dramatic. A grain inspector in the early 1940s does not move the harvest, or buy it, or boast about it. He opens the trier, draws a sample, levels the grain on a board, and lets his hands and nose do the quiet work of noticing. This morning, the kernels from western Nebraska feel a little cooler than they should, and just slightly heavy. It is the sort of difference that could be missed by anyone in a hurry, yet this whole day will turn on whether one careful man chooses to pause over it. So before the city fully wakes, and before the buyers and clerks begin their ordinary objections, we can stay with him a little longer in that dim room, and see what, exactly, he noticed. The lamp above the bench throws a pale circle over the grain, and in that light the kernels look sound enough at first glance. They are hard red winter wheat, mostly even in color, reddish-brown with the dull gold edge that comes from travel and handling. A less patient man might have called them ordinary and moved on to the next car. But your palm tells a different story. The grain does not run as freely as it should when you tip it from one hand to the other. It drags just a little, as if each kernel has taken on a breath of dampness from somewhere west of the river. That small drag is the first concrete trouble of the morning, and it means the car standing outside cannot simply be entered, graded, and released without another look. You set the first sample aside, not far, just to the left of the grading board, where doubtful grain waits for a second opinion. Then you reach for the long compartmented trier again. The trier is plain steel, cool in the fingers, with openings along its length that can be turned shut or opened inside a carload of grain. It is not complicated, and yet almost everything depends on how it is used. If you pull only from the top, you learn what the weather did to the surface. If you pull from depth, you learn what the grain itself has been doing in the dark. So, you make the morning slower on purpose. That is the first decision. Instead of accepting one draw from one car, you mark the car number on a card, step out into the half-light, and ask that the seal be checked while you take another probe from farther back in the load. The yard is still grey, the boards damp underfoot, and the long side of the elevator house holds the night cold a little longer than the street would. Somewhere up above, belts have not yet begun their full-day hum, but you can hear a motor tested and let go again. The railroad clerk at the platform glances up when you ask for the car sheet. He is not troubled yet. He expects the usual thing, a few moments of sampling, a note in pencil, a grade to follow. Instead, you compare the numbers twice and climb the narrow ladder to the car door. When the trier goes in, there is a certain resistance. Not much, just enough that you notice. The grain parts around the steel tube, then closes more slowly than clean, dry wheat usually does. When you draw the sample out and pour it into the pan, a faint odor rises. Not fully sour, not clean either. It is the smell of storage beginning to turn inward on itself. Not spoilage in the common obvious sense. Not yet, just the early breath of wheat that has held too much moisture too long in too little air. That is the second development, and now the room behind you is no longer only a room. It is the place where a private unease has to become a written thing. Back at the bench, you spread the new sample thin across the grading board with the flat of your hand. The board is worn smooth from years of grain dragged over it in careful layers. You look for shrunken kernels. You look for weed seed, for bits of straw, for cracked grain, for dirt that will show up later as dockage. There is not much foreign matter. In another way, that would have made the work easier. A dirty sample can be explained by field conditions, careless loading, rough handling. This is more delicate than that. The wheat is outwardly respectable. It is the condition inside the lot that is wrong. You lean closer and breathe again. The smell is clearer now, a little sweet, a little stale. The beginning of heat, not from a fire anyone would see, but from the quiet life of damp grain packed too close together in transit. You have seen this before in smaller lots. A shower at loading, a delay on a siding, a car not ventilated as it should be. What makes this different is the origin card clipped to the sheet. Western Nebraska. Several cars, same route, same consignee class, same morning arrival. One doubtful sample might be a nuisance. A string of doubtful cars becomes a pattern, and patterns are expensive. So before the buyers arrive, you send word for 2 more cars in the same run to be opened for inspection, ahead of the usual order. That request is enough to alter the shape of the morning. Men who expected grain to move at a steady pace now have to wait while one inspector follows a feeling into paperwork. The weighing desk notices first. The scale man, coat still buttoned to the throat against the dawn chill, comes to the doorway with his pencil tucked over one ear. He asks whether you want the gross and tare figures held aside. You tell him yes for these cars, and he does not argue, but he gives the smallest lift of the brow. Held figures mean held transactions. Held transactions mean somebody very soon will want to know why. You write the car numbers carefully, ink first, then a blotter, then the sample tags tied with thin cord. The ritual is plain, and because it is plain, it matters. You cannot remember later what a hand felt unless you make the paper remember for you. The city is waking by then. Through the open crack of the side door comes the smell of coal smoke and river damp. A truck changes gear in the street beyond the yard. Inside the elevator house, the belts begin at last, a low, continuous motion overhead, boards trembling faintly under the machinery's weight. The room is still not dramatic. It is just busier now, and busyness has a way of pressing men toward shortcuts. The next sample from the second car confirms enough to harden your suspicion. These kernels are caking very slightly when pressed together on the board. Not wet to the eye, not wet enough to shine, but they hold shape for a breath before loosening. Healthy dry grain should flow apart at once. You note condition concerns and lower the provisional assessment in pencil. That single downward mark is small on the page. Its effect is not. A lower grade can change the price paid, the bin chosen, the buyer's willingness to take delivery, even whether the wheat is blended, cleaned, dried, or sent on without delay. The room feels smaller after you write it, not because anyone raises his voice, because the act of writing removes the comfort of uncertainty. Now there is something to object to. A messenger from the office appears with the prior shipping notation. The country point had described the lot more favorably. Good test weight, fairly clean. No unusual odor reported. That happens sometimes, honestly enough. Conditions change between origin and destination. A car can stand too long in weather. A load that was safe on the prairie can begin to warm by the time it reaches Omaha. Still, the difference between the shipping description and what sits before you means you cannot soften your language to spare anyone a difficult morning. So you compare the earlier notation against your own sample cards and ask for confirmation draws from deeper in the remaining cars. This is the third choice that makes retreat harder. By now, the railroad clerk has stopped treating the delay as a passing inconvenience. He comes in with his ledger under one arm and stands just inside the door, careful not to step where the loose grain lies around the bench legs. He asks whether the cars may be released in sequence while only the doubtful one is held. You tell him not yet. Same route, same weather, same timing. You want to see more before any of them disappear into the usual stream of unloading and receipts. He nods, but the nod has weight in it. A yard runs on order. An interruption in one corner can travel a long way by noon. Outside, the light has turned from grey to a flat winter silver. The river is somewhere beyond the warehouses, unseen but felt in the coldness of the air. Men cross the yard carrying dinner pails and rolled papers. An elevator superintendent, broad-shouldered and already dusty at the cuffs, pauses near the car line to ask what is being held. The clerk gestures toward your room. That is how such mornings spread, not with alarm, with glances, with a pause in one man's walk that causes another man to ask a question. You are still with the grain itself. You slit open a small retained sample sack from the first drawer and mix it with the second, turning it with a divider so no handful receives more than its share. The motions are repetitive, almost gentle. Pour. Split, recombine, reduce. At each pass, you remove some of the accident from the sample and leave more of the truth. When you lean down again, the odor is no stronger than before, but it is unmistakable now. Not mold exactly, more the breath of grain beginning to work. The kind of thing that can deepen in a warm bin and trouble a whole lot later. A few dark flecks catch your eye. Not insect damage. Fragments where kernels have broken under handling and then clung to one another. The grain has lived too close to damp. That is enough for you to write a lower provisional grade on the second car as well. The superintendent comes in a few minutes later, hat in hand, trying politeness first. He asks whether the line can be kept moving if his men route these cars straight to a separate bin. You say separate storage might become necessary, but the grade comes first. He asks whether the condition could be from the car itself rather than the wheat. A leaking roof hatch, perhaps. Condensation on the journey. You tell him it may be part of it, and that is exactly why you need more than one sample from more than one car. He does not press further, but he stays in the doorway as if mere presence might shorten the process. It does not. There is comfort, in a way, in how little your tools change while the pressure around you rises. The scale remains the same small balance. The sieve remains the same shallow frame. The grade cards are still only cards, yet each object now sits in a wider field of consequence. A buyer not yet present may lose money by noon because of what you write before breakfast. A mill may reject a lot later in the week because of what your nose caught in this room. The public, if it thinks of grain at all, imagines acres, weather, locomotives, war demand, bread. Almost no one imagines this bench, and still the bench decides what those larger things must call the wheat. The third car comes in under the trier, with the same quiet resistance. This time, when the grain hits the pan, one portion near the bottom falls in a short clump before breaking apart. That is new, and it is enough to make the superintendent stop looking merely patient. He steps closer. You spread the sample, touch it, smell it, and say very little. There is no need for much language. The evidence is now repeating itself. Same route, same damp character, same early heating. If you let the cars go as originally described, they may be blended with sound grain inside the elevator. Once mixed, the condition would be harder to trace and harder to correct. That is the practical stake hidden inside the quietness of the room. So you ask for the retained paperwork on the whole consignment, not just the first two cars. The office boy brings a stack of sheets clipped together, still cool from the file drawer. You lay them flat and compare origin points, dates loaded, dates received, weather notes, and car numbers. The pattern settles in front of you with the calm of something that was always there. These cars were not random neighbors in the yard. They were a run. Loaded in a narrow span. Moved east after a damp spell. Reported as ordinary. Arrived in condition that is not ordinary. The superintendent exhales through his nose and looks toward the office windows. That is where the argument will have to go next. But before anyone can argue about price or inconvenience, you have to turn the room's private findings into the language of the standards. You note odor. You note condition. You note that confirmation is requested. The wording matters because it must be exact enough to stand and plain enough that another inspector could understand what you saw without standing where you stood. You are not writing a speech. You are leaving tracks. By now, the buyers have begun to arrive in ones and twos, collars up, shoes clicking on the worn boards outside the office corridor. They do not come to you immediately. First, they go to the desks where rumors become terms. Then one of them, a local grain man with a careful voice and gloves tucked into one pocket, asks whether the downgrade is truly necessary. He does not say downgrade at first. He says whether there is some room in the reading. That is how pressure sounds in this world. Not loud, not theatrical. Just an invitation to be less certain than you are. You tell him what the samples show. Cool grain, heavy hand feel, slight caking off odor, repeated in multiple cars. He asks whether drying would restore the lot after receipt. You tell him drying may preserve it, but it does not change what arrived. That answer closes one door and opens a longer day. The buyer thanks you in the thin way men do when they are already planning the next office to visit. Within minutes, another clerk asks if the telegraphed shipping reports can be rechecked. Then another wants to know whether the first car might simply have been near a damp section of track overnight. Each question is modest by itself. Together, they form the beginning of a push. And because they are all circling the same point, you understand that the matter has moved beyond one uncertain sample. The issue now is whether this morning will be treated as a small delay or a documented flaw affecting several firms at once. You could still choose the narrower path. You could mark the first cars as doubtful, issue cautious language, and let the rest move unless stronger evidence appears later. That would spare everyone some trouble, including yourself. It would also leave open the chance that compromised wheat enters ordinary storage before the full condition is known. So you make the larger choice. You ask that sealed reference samples be brought from the retained lot cabinet, and you begin comparing the whole consignment as a linked shipment, rather than as isolated cars. The room grows quieter when you do that, not because men leave, because they understand what the act means. A broader review is harder to dismiss as over-attention. It creates a chain. If one office asks later why the grain was held, there will be not one doubtful handful, but a sequence of numbered samples, each tied to a car, a route, a date, and a set of observations made before unloading. You break the seals, check the tags, and line the samples in order. The cloth sacks are small enough to fit in one hand. Their contents are not. Each holds a piece of somebody's contract, somebody's schedule, somebody's margin. You compare color first, then odor, then the way the grain moves under the fingers. No single sack is shocking. That is almost the most difficult part. The trouble never announces itself cleanly. It asks to be overlooked. A little heaviness here, a little stale sweetness there. A note of warmth deep in the sample that you catch only after the grain has lain on the board for a minute. Taken together, though, the line of sacks tells one calm, unwelcome story. The condition was not imagined. It traveled with the run. When you finish the fourth comparison, the chief from the attached federal office sends word that he wants a preliminary report before the noon clerks begin their certificates. And that means the morning has crossed a threshold. The bench work is no longer only bench work. The sample tags lie in a neat row by your left hand, and each one now feels heavier than its paperweight. You gather the sheets, square their corners against the bench, and wipe the grain dust from your fingers before you carry them down the short corridor. The federal office is only a few rooms away, but it belongs to a different tempo. In the sample room, you work by touch, smell, and habit. In the office, the same facts have to survive carbon copies, type bars, signatures, and the flat patience of a file drawer. The chief keeps his coat on indoors until the building fully warms, and when you enter he is standing beside a high desk with his spectacles low on his nose. He does not ask for a story. He asks for car numbers, route, condition, and whether the observations repeat across the run. That is the nature of the work. A good inspector learns to turn a roomful of impressions into plain sentences that another man can trust. You tell him the grain feels cool and heavy in hand. You tell him the odor is slightly sour-sweet, with early heating suggested. You tell him caking appears in several drawers and that the condition repeats across multiple cars from the same line of shipment. He listens without interruption, one thumb holding the edge of a form as if he has already begun placing your words into the proper spaces. Then he asks the quieter question. Has any car been unloaded yet? You say no. He nods once, and the nod carries relief, though not comfort. If the grain had already gone into the house, the matter would be more complicated. Blended grain is harder to argue over because it becomes everybody's inconvenience and nobody's clear responsibility. As it stands, the evidence still belongs to the cars in which it arrived. That is cleaner. Not easier, but cleaner. He tells the clerk at the typewriter to hold the ordinary certificate blanks for that route. The clerk stops in the middle of a line, pulls the page free, and turns the roller back with a small metallic chatter. A pause like that can travel through a building. One desk stops, then another. Somebody in the market office asks why the forms are being held. No one answers loudly. There is never much loudness in places built on paperwork, only doors opening, closing, and a change in the speed of footsteps. You set the retained samples on the table under the north window. The light there is better by late morning, cold but honest. Your chief opens one sack, then another, and performs the same unadorned test you already have. He pours a little into his palm, he rubs the kernels with his thumb, he bends and smells. The room is so quiet that the grain falling back into the pan sounds like dry rain. He says the odor is there, not strong, enough. That single word, enough, does not sound like much. But in this trade, enough can move a trainload. He asks whether the shipping reports gave any warning. You hand him the telegraphed descriptions. Good weight, fairly clean. No unusual odor noted. He studies the phrases with the mild weariness of a man who has seen language arrive too tidy from a distance. Country reports are not always wrong. Sometimes they are simply early. Grain leaves one place sound enough, then rides through delay, weather, and poor air, and arrives with a different character. Still, the difference must be accounted for. You cannot have standards that shift according to sympathy. So he tells you to draft a provisional statement for the lot. Lower than expected grade, condition concerns noted, confirmation to follow where necessary. The wording is spare. It has to be. Too soft, and it means nothing. Too broad, and it invites arguments you cannot support. You sit at the side desk and begin in longhand before the typist makes it official. Car numbers first, route next, observed condition, probable effect on grade, need for held movement pending certificate. The nib scratches lightly over the paper. Outside the office window, a locomotive gives a low note somewhere beyond the sheds, and then the yard returns to its layered clanking and pause. While you write, the first of the grain men comes in. He removes his hat before speaking to the chief, as if formality may help him more than force. He asks whether the morning's hold is truly broad enough to justify stopping several cars. The chief does not answer with opinion. He gestures to the samples. He smells one, then another, though not very confidently. Most buyers know grain well enough. Few of them want to make the official call when a lower grade will cost someone money. He says the odor is faint. The chief agrees that it is faint. Then he adds that faint is often how trouble begins. That answer leaves little room for bargaining, so the buyer tries another path. Could the condition be noted without lowering the grade yet? Could the matter wait until drying and cleaning reveal whether the lot improves? You keep writing. The chief says the certificate must describe what arrived, not what later handling may rescue. That is one of the plain rules hidden under the whole market. A grade is not a favor toward future outcomes. It is a judgment on present condition. The buyer gives a short breath through his nose, thanks the chief, and leaves to carry the bad news further down the hall. Soon after, an elevator superintendent appears, then a railroad representative with polished shoes, darkened by yard dust at the edges. They speak in measured tones. No one wants a scene. Scenes do not help contracts. The superintendent says his men can segregate the lot if necessary. The railroad man says transit conditions should be considered. The chief says they are being considered, but transit does not erase observed condition at destination. The words move in circles for a while. You hear your own phrases return to you with altered emphasis. Slight odor becomes merely travel smell. Cool and heavy in hand becomes perhaps the weather of the morning. Repeated condition across cars becomes still a matter for caution rather than conclusion. This, too, is part of the job. Not just noticing grain, but hearing how men try to round down what you noticed into something easier to absorb. Your chief is patient, because patience is stronger than heat here. He asks whether anyone can point to a sound car in the same run that has already been examined and found clean of the issue. No one can. He asks whether any of the men present wishes to request formal appeal after the certificate is issued. Two of them exchange a look. One says they may. That is the first time the word appeal is spoken aloud. Once spoken, it changes the shape of the afternoon before it has even begun. But first, there must be a certificate. The typist rolls in the proper sheet, with its pre-printed spaces and official lines that make every judgment look calmer than it felt in the room where it was made. You stand beside her and spell out the route, the car sequence, the grade terms, the condition note. Every letter matters because one mistyped car number can detach a fact from the grain it belongs to. The machine strikes with that hard, regular office rhythm that seems final before anything has even been signed. When she finishes the first copy, she lays a blotter over it, then peels it back to inspect the line of type. No flourish, no emotion. Just the exact words that will now travel farther than your voice ever could. Your chief reads the certificate through once in silence. Then he takes his pen, writes the date in a steady hand, and signs. The pen point makes the faintest hitch in the paper where his surname begins. You notice such things when you spend enough time around official documents. The signature is not dramatic. It never is, yet it is the true center of the day. Before it, there was still room for this to remain a concern among work tables. After it, the lower assessment exists in the market whether anyone likes it or not. Carbon copies are separated, one for the office, one for the consignee, one for the elevator records, one to move with the shipment in the chain of understanding that follows grain from yard to bin to resale. The original lies on the desk for a moment, drying. You can feel the room settle around it. Not calm exactly, more the settling that happens after a tool has struck and everyone has heard where it landed. The superintendent asks very evenly whether the note on condition could be phrased more narrowly. Your chief says no. The railroad man asks whether the whole run must be held under the same concern. Your chief says each car is judged on its sample, but the repeated condition justifies the broader caution already taken. The buyer, now returned, asks whether an immediate appeal may be prepared. Your chief says yes. After all, local reference samples are properly sealed and checked. And just like that, the argument shifts. The question is no longer whether the certificate will exist. It exists. The question now is whether it can be challenged without flaw. That is a different labor. Quieter in some ways, more exacting in others. You are sent back to the sample room with instructions to prepare retained portions for appeal review. The corridor feels longer returning than it did going out, not because of distance, because once an official paper is signed, every ordinary object in the sample room acquires another responsibility. The divider must be clean, the envelopes must match the ledger, the tags must carry the correct car numbers in the correct hand. If anything in the chain is careless now, the entire morning can be recast as uncertainty. Back at the bench, the grain lies where you left some of it, still spread thin on the board, still carrying that quiet inward smell. The room has warmed a little with the day, and warmth makes condition easier to read. One sample now gives off a duller sweetness than before, not stronger by much, just less easy to deny. You draw the retained sacks toward you and begin the old patient sequence. Mix, level, reduce. Seal. Each lot must be made representative. That word carries more of the job than most people know. Representative means the sample has to stand for the whole car without favoring the cleaner top or the worse bottom. It must be fair to grain and to buyer both. You cannot seize only the worst handful and call it truth. You cannot smooth over the bad handful either. So you use the divider over and over, letting gravity and repeated passes do what judgment alone should not. The grain falls into equal channels with a soft controlled hiss, half returned, half set aside, then mixed again. Routine becomes protection, not against the grain itself, but against argument. At noon, men elsewhere in Omaha are opening pails, unwrapping sandwiches, pouring coffee from dented thermos bottles. In the sample room, lunch is later if it comes at all. There is a heel of bread in your coat pocket from early morning, and for now that is enough. You chew without hurry while you write the first appeal labels. Car number, date received, date sampled. Initial grade determination, condition note, inspector initials, chief's office reference. The words stack one under another until the tag looks overburdened for such a small square of card. Yet all of it must travel with the sample, because memory is never accepted where records can be had. Outside, footsteps pass in irregular groups. You can tell from the pace whether they belong to yardmen, clerks, or grain buyers. Yardmen walk as if the building is part of their route. Clerks move more quickly with corners to turn. Buyers pause outside doors. That pause is familiar now. The morning's ripple has become part of the day's current. People who expected the week to be ordinary have had to rearrange their assumptions around one certificate. A messenger brings down a note from the office. Appeal requested on selected cars. Prepare sealed reference portions immediately. Check retained sample ledger against receiving sheets before closure. That last instruction matters. A man can survive an argument over odor. He cannot survive a challenge that reveals his tags do not match his books. So you clear the bench completely. Loose grain brushed into a catch pan. Unused sacks set aside. Pens tested. Fresh blotter laid down. Then you open the ledger to the morning entries and compare them line by line against the receiving sheets from the yard. One car number. Then another. Origin point. Arrival notation. Sample time. Seal condition. Every entry has its place. This is the hidden half of authority, not the confidence to speak, but the patience to verify. The room smells of dust, paper, and wheat, just beginning to trouble itself. There is comfort in the sameness of the objects, even while the day itself has grown more complicated. The brass scale weights still sit in their little box with round hollows for each size. The sieve frame still has one patched corner where old use split the wood and someone mended it rather than replace it. The trier still rests along the wall, streaked with flowery dust and light from the high window. A stranger might think nothing much has happened here. That is often how real work looks. When it is done well, very little appears to change. Yet by early afternoon, desks elsewhere are recalculating price differences because of the marks you made before breakfast. One elevator is holding back bin assignments. A consignee is deciding whether to appeal or absorb the lower value. A railroad clerk is revising expected release times for cars that would otherwise already be emptying into the house. The grain itself remains where it was, silent, patient, not knowing it has become expensive. The first appeal envelopes are heavy paper, lined and gummed, stronger than the little sample sacks used for routine reference. You spoon the reduced portions into them carefully, making sure each holds enough for independent grading without being so full that the seal will strain. Then you fold the flaps, moisten the gum, press them shut, and set them under a board to dry flat. After that come the wax seals. Not every office uses them in exactly the same way, but here the added formality helps. A softened stick over the lamp, a bead of dark wax at the fold, the office stamp pressed into it before it fully cools. When done well, the seal is modest and almost old-fashioned. When broken later, it tells a story with no room for eloquence. This envelope was closed. This envelope was opened. Nothing else. A clerk from upstairs brings down a stack of duplicate forms and asks, in the way men ask casual questions when they want firm news, whether the issue appears in all cars or only some. You tell him the repeated condition is enough to justify concern across the run, but each car's sample must still stand on its own. He nods, as if that answer will not satisfy the office above, which is probably true. He lingers just long enough to glance at the grain on the board. Then he says he can smell it now. That is the thing about such cases. Once a condition has been named, other senses seem to catch up. The room teaches their noses what to look for. By 1:30, the chief sends for you again. He wants the retained sample comparison brought upstairs, along with your notes on the differences between the country telegraph and destination condition. You carry the papers and sacks in a shallow tray because a spill on the stair would be too foolish to survive. The office has grown fuller. 2 men from a trading firm stand near the stove, speaking softly. A stenographer is recopying a letter. The chief's desk now holds not only the certificate, but correspondence forms, appeal requests, and a small stack of market bulletins pushed to one side, because today's trouble has crowded out routine reading. He asks you to explain in plain order why the lower grade was entered despite the favorable shipping report. So you do. You begin with the hand feel, then the odor, then the caking, then the repeated appearance across several cars from the same run. Then the risk of unloading into common storage before the condition was sorted. One of the firm men interrupts to say hand feel is subjective. Your chief does not rebuke him, he simply asks whether he disputes the caking and odor as well. The man says he disputes the weight placed on them. Again the circles begin, not around facts this time, but around interpretation. And interpretation, in grain, is where professional standing lives. You are not a chemist in a white coat. You are something older and more practical than that. A man trusted to read what harvest and transit have done to kernels by using methods shaped from long habit, standard language, and repeated comparison. There can be moisture tests, of course. There can be dockage percentages and test weights. But before instruments settle every question, a trained nose often starts the case. The chief asks for the test weight figures. The clerk fetches them. They are not disastrous. That almost makes matters harder. If the grain were plainly poor in every measurable way, no one would waste time pressing. But middling numbers with troubling condition create room for dispute. The lot can still look saleable on paper while carrying something less visible in the sample room. The chief taps the sheet once with a fingernail. He says the figures do not rescue the odor. He says condition is part of grade, not an ornament beside it. And because he says it so flatly, the room has nowhere softer to go. One of the firm men then asks for a formal moisture check on selected portions. That request is fair enough. The chief grants it, not because the certificate is weak, but because an added measure can support what hand and nose already suggested. So more work appears, as quiet work often does, from inside the work already done. You return to the sample room and prepare portions for testing. The methods are not glamorous. A weighed amount, a controlled drying process, a comparison before and after. It takes time, and time is one of the hidden costs in every challenge. While the portions are prepared, you notice how the afternoon light has changed. The north window is less sharp now. Dust hangs in it more visibly. Somewhere overhead, the elevator machinery has settled into the steady full-day rhythm, belts carrying, cups lifting, grain moving in volumes so much larger than the handfuls on your table that the scale difference almost seems absurd. Yet bulk movement depends on tiny judgments. That is the comfort and the burden of your trade. The superintendent comes down alone this time. His manner is changed from the morning, less defensive, more practical. He asks, if the lower grade stands, how many bins must be kept clear to avoid mixing this run with cleaner wheat already in-house? You tell him that depends on how much of the route proves similarly affected, but segregation should begin now rather than later. He studies the tags laid out on your bench. Then he says he wishes the country points had warned them more plainly. It is not exactly an apology, closer to resignation. You say, the country points may not have seen what transit made of it. He says, maybe so. The two of you stand for a moment without speaking, listening to the machinery and the far thump of grain somewhere beyond the walls. This is another truth of forgotten work. Most arguments in it do not end with a victory speech. They just become arrangements. He asks whether one suspect lot can spoil a larger blended bin. You say not always at once, and not in every degree, but heating grain can carry trouble into storage, especially if mixed where warmth and moisture cannot be traced after the fact. He nods, looking not at you but at the sample board. Then he says he will have the foreman ready a separate space. That sentence costs labor, time, and money. Yet he says it as quietly as if ordering more twine. Because once the certificate exists, resistance has to turn practical. By mid-afternoon, the moisture checks begin coming back. They do not scream disaster. Again, that would almost be simpler. They show just enough elevation to support your earlier sense. Not soaked, not openly damaged, just above where comfort belongs for grain expected to travel and store without complaint. The chief reads the figures, adds them to the file, and says they strengthen the condition note. A copy is made. Another line enters the record. And with each added line, the dispute becomes a little less about opinion and a little more about whether the paper can be made to hold. You sit back down at the bench and pull the receiving ledger closer, because now every number has to agree with every other number. In grain work, a man can survive being doubted for severity. He cannot survive being doubted for carelessness, so you go through the run again, slowly, tracing car initials and numerals with one finger. The railroad marks matter, the loading dates matter. The order in which the cars reached Omaha matters. A shipment is never just wheat. It is wheat attached to names, to routes, to contracts, to space in bins not yet filled. One car can be disputed by itself. Several linked cars, if they carry the same defect, become something much larger than one morning's caution. The yard office has sent down another packet of waybills, folded once and still damp at the edge from a clerk's hands. You open them beside the ledger and compare the sequence. The first few agree exactly. Then one entry does not. It is small. Only a single transposed pair in the middle of a car number, the sort of error a man makes if he is copying fast while two voices are talking near his desk. But small errors are the ones that do the most damage, because they look harmless until someone needs a chain of proof. You stop there. You compare the doubtful line against the sample tag tied to the retained sack, then against the office copy, then against the rail sheet. The sack and the office copy agree with each other. The yard sheet does not. That is the first real setback of the afternoon, though not the kind anyone across the hall would notice. To them, the grain is still grain. To you, the case has just acquired a loose board in the floor. You send for the clerk who wrote the yard sheet. He comes in with his cap in his hands, younger than most of the men now moving through the corridor, and already worried before you speak. You show him the number. He leans over the bench and squints. Then he says yes, that one should have been copied from the previous line, but he must have carried the digits over wrong. He offers to write a fresh sheet at once. You tell him not yet. Nothing can simply disappear once the day's work has gone this far. If a correction is made, it must be made openly, with notation, initials, and reason. Otherwise, a harmless clerical slip begins to look like a hidden change. The chief is called down. He studies the mismatch without irritation. That is another skill in quiet offices. Not every mistake deserves drama. Some deserve method. He has the clerk write a corrected notation on a new line, mark the original as copied in error, and initial both entries in your presence. Then he asks you to compare the corrected number against the seal record from the car's arrival. It matches. The matter is repaired, not erased, but repaired. And that difference matters. Good records do not pretend no mistake was made. They show what happened and how it was set right. The young clerk thanks you more earnestly than the occasion requires. You nod, and he goes back up the corridor with the careful walk of a man who will copy more slowly for the rest of the week. That one corrected digit does something larger than save a page. It keeps the appeal from taking root in the wrong kind of uncertainty. If the buyers can argue about odor, they still must argue within the rules. If they can argue about identity, then the rules themselves begin to blur. So you retie the tag on that sample, tighten the knot, and set it in the front row of envelopes where it belongs. The room is warmer now. The afternoon has laid its mild fatigue over everything. Dust has settled into the grain of the bench top. The trier against the wall no longer feels cold when you lift it. Even the sounds beyond the room have changed. Morning noises carry questions. Afternoon noises carry consequences. A truck backs against a platform and waits longer than planned. Somewhere above, a gate opens, then closes, then opens again as a different lot is routed around held grain. You can hear adjustment in machinery if you know the place well enough. The superintendent returns near 3 o'clock with one of his foremen. The foreman is a compact man with flour at the knees of his trousers and the habit of looking upward whenever he thinks. He asks you to walk the house with them before the next unloading decision is made. You take your coat from the peg, brush the wheat dust from the sleeves, and follow them out of the sample room into the larger building where your morning's handwriting has begun to rearrange space. The elevator house is warmer than the corridor and louder in a soft, continuous way. Belts travel overhead in dark housings. Buckets lift grain somewhere inside the legs with a dry running murmur. Dust hangs in shafts of light from high windows, turning each beam into something almost solid. The floor underfoot is worn smooth where men have crossed it for years in the same practical paths. Nothing in the building calls attention to itself. That is one reason such places fade from memory so easily. They do enormous work without posing. The superintendent leads you along the bin floor and points with 2 fingers, not at the grain itself but at absence. This bin must stay clear. That one can take sound wheat from a different route. The narrow compartment near the drying equipment may have to receive the disputed run if the hold extends into evening. A grading decision made in a room no larger than a modest kitchen has become a question of boards, chutes, labor assignments, and the sequence of gate openings. You stop by a hatch where a man below is sweeping spilled kernels toward a shovel. The superintendent says if the lower cars had gone through at once, his men would likely have blended them into a larger lot before noon. Not maliciously, not carelessly, simply because that is how ordinary days work. Space is always being made and used. Grain arrives faster than men can admire it. So things move. That is the hidden value of a timely inspection. It does not produce anything. It prevents wrong mixtures from becoming normal facts. You walk farther into the house, past a scale beam and a set of downspouts painted years ago in colors now dim under dust. The foreman opens a small inspection door on one side of a spout and lets you smell the wheat moving through. This lot is cleaner, cooler. It has the dry cereal scent of grain that has not begun to work against itself. The contrast is almost soothing. It confirms, by difference, what your own sample room had already shown. Good wheat does not ask to be interpreted for long. It is plain in the hand and plain in the nose. Troubled wheat asks for patience. At the drying apparatus, which is modest by later standards and more useful for management than rescue, the foreman explains how much can be handled in a shift. Not enough for carelessness. Not enough to undo a large mistake in one easy motion. Drying grain takes time. Cleaning grain takes time. Segregating cars takes labor that had been promised elsewhere by the morning schedule. He speaks without complaint, just arithmetic. That, too, is part of the atmosphere of old industrial work. Most resistance eventually turns into arithmetic. How much room? How much time? How many men? How many cars can wait before the railroad begins asking harder questions? You ask whether another car from the same origin has yet been opened on the opposite side of the house. The superintendent says one is being positioned now because he would rather know before dark than after. That is another shift in the day. In the morning, men wanted the issue smaller. By afternoon, they wanted clearer. Clarity may be expensive, but uncertainty spreads farther. So you go with them to the receiving side, where the unopened car waits under a platform lamp that is unnecessary yet still lit against the dim interior. The seal is checked, the number is called out, a clerk writes it down, then the door is worked aside with the usual effort, wood and metal moving reluctantly against grain pressure within. The first smell is always mixed with outside air. It tells little. Then the foreman eases a little grain into a pan. This time before you even touch it. The odor is stronger, not violent, not rotten. Just more advanced than the morning lot. A dull, warm sweetness, the sort that belongs in mash and feed rooms, not in good wheat fresh to market. The superintendent's face changes by 1 degree. That is all. Enough to show he no longer expects the trouble to stay abstract. You take the sample, spread it across the pan, and see a few kernels matted by pressure into small, soft clumps that break under the fingers. There is no need now to persuade anyone standing there. This is the development the whole day has been moving toward. Not because you wanted to be proved right, but because physical evidence settles what talk leaves open. The foreman says quietly that if this had gone into the upper blending run, they would have carried the condition halfway across the house before anyone caught the smell. That is not an exaggeration. Once grain begins moving in volume, one lot gives itself to another very quickly. A bad decision can be distributed in less time than it takes to explain it. You ask for a fresh tag and make the notation there, in the house, before the details can blur. Car number, origin. Condition on opening, noticeably stronger off odor, more advanced caking. Recommend segregation with prior held cars. The superintendent watches you write. Then he says he will change the bin assignment immediately. Again, no speech. No admission, just a practical sentence that redirects men and machinery. A runner is sent off at once. A gate that would have been opened is left shut. Another route is prepared. Somewhere above you, because of this, a different wheat begins running through a different line. The building responds to judgment the way a body responds to pressure on a joint. Quietly, completely. You walk back toward the office side with the new sample in hand. The superintendent comes beside you more slowly than before. He says he did not like being stopped this morning. You tell him that was plain enough. He gives a brief sound that is almost a laugh, but not sharp. Then he says no man likes having his day widened by another man's caution. After a moment he adds that he likes mixed bins less. That is as close to agreement as such days usually offer. By the time you return to the sample room, the chief has already heard that another car was worse. News travels in industrial places without anyone formally carrying it. A laborer says one sentence to a clerk. A clerk says 2 words to the office. A typewriter pauses. That is enough. He asks for your notation and attaches it to the growing file. The folder is thick now. Waybills, sample cards, provisional notes, certificate copies, moisture figures, appeal requests, corrected ledger line, segregation recommendation. A whole day can vanish from common memory and still leave half an inch of paper behind. Late afternoon is when fatigue begins threatening precision. That is why the last hours matter so much. A man who has been exact since dawn may be tempted, after enough interruptions, to trust memory where he should still trust ink. You do not let yourself do that. You open the cabinet where the remaining retained samples are kept and begin one more comparison, because the appeal will ask whether conditions worsened gradually along the route or varied without pattern. The answer may affect how the higher office reads the shipment, so you line the sacks by loading point and arrival order. Western Nebraska stations, each one little more to most people than a name on a telegraph line. To you, for this afternoon, they become a sequence of weather and delay. This car loaded after rain, that one perhaps stood longer on a siding. Another may have picked up its trouble under a roof that did not keep all the damp out. You cannot know every moment of their travel, but you can sometimes see the shape of travel afterward, written faintly on the kernels. The earlier loaded cars are not always worse. That rules out one easy theory. But the cars known to have passed through a longer wait before exchange do tend toward heavier odor. That is enough to suggest handling and delay, not just field moisture at origin. You note it carefully because grain men will ask whether blame lies west, east, or in between. The truth is often distributed. Harvest meets weather. Weather meets storage. Storage meets rail timing. Rail timing meets destination. And then a man in one small room has to say what condition all those things became together. A messenger from the telegraph desk brings a request from a trading office across town. They want to know whether the entire consignment should be considered suspect for price revision. The chief declines to say it that broadly in telegram form. Each car stands by its sample. Still, he allows language advising caution across the run pending appeal. That kind of phrasing is common in honest offices. Strong enough to guide conduct, narrow enough to survive review. As the message is prepared, you think about how little of this will ever be visible beyond a few desks. No newspaper will explain the afternoon by telling readers that a sample room smelled wrong before sunrise. If the grain is diverted, dried, cleaned, or discounted, the outside world will simply receive flour, feed, or revised invoices. The labor of making those outcomes orderly stays hidden under ordinary words. Even within the trade, men remember the lot more often than the inspector. They remember there was a damp Nebraska run that month. They remember prices had to be adjusted. They remember bins were tied up for a day and a half. The person who made the first unwelcome pause becomes only part of the paperwork's weather. The chief asks you, before the office closes to outside callers, to prepare the appeal package itself. That means everything must now be assembled in the order a higher inspector would expect to see it. Cover sheet, certificate copy, grounds for appeal, sample identification, seal record, supporting moisture figures, notation of corrected yard entry. You spread the papers on the bench in rows and check them twice, then a third time. Appeals are not won by eloquence. They are won by giving another office no reason to distrust the chain. The envelopes are dry now. The wax has cooled hard and dull. You write the office address in a clean hand, adding the branch designation and routing notation so the package does not spend a night on the wrong desk. Then you wrap the group in stout paper and tie it with twine. The knot matters less than the seal across it, but you tie it neatly anyway. Care in one place encourages care in another. The chief comes down to inspect the bundle before it leaves the building. He turns it over once, checks the labels, presses a thumb lightly near the wax, and nods. Then he asks you to read the car numbers aloud while he follows with the list. You do, one by one. The rhythm is almost liturgical by now. Letter marks, digits, station names, dates. It calms the room to hear them spoken correctly. Nothing settles men like ordered facts when the day has spent itself in contested interpretation. When the reading is done, he signs across the outer flap and writes the time, not because the hour changes the grain, but because time itself is part of custody. A sample in a drawer at noon is one thing, a sample leaving the office at 4:30 under appeal is another. The package is handed to the office messenger, who will carry it first thing to the proper rail express connection. He cradles it carefully, as though he senses, even if he does not know in detail, that it contains more than wheat. After he leaves, the building exhales a little, not into quiet, into a new phase. The major decision has been made. The appeal has been secured. What remains is the practical evening work, seeing where the grain goes, how it is kept apart, and whether the last incoming cars confirm or complicate the pattern. The superintendent has asked that you make one more round in the elevator before dark, so after a brief pause at the bench, you do. The daylight now comes lower through the windows, amber at the edge and grey in the middle. Dust turns softer in it. The house sounds larger at this hour, not because the machinery is louder, but because fewer voices are competing with it. You pass men finishing a transfer, their motions economical from long habit. One opens a slide gate, another watches the flow. A third marks a tally on a board with a bit of chalk already worn to the width of his thumb. No one among them would describe himself as part of an invisible system. He is simply doing his shift, yet the whole market depends on people whose names do not travel. At the segregated bin, the foreman shows you the arrangement made for the held lot. The disputed cars will be directed here, not near the cleaner reserve. Another compartment, smaller and awkwardly placed, has been left available in case the later arrivals prove uneven rather than uniformly troubled. This is good management. Not elegant, but sensible. Grain work rewards sensible arrangements much more than clever ones. You lean over the edge and smell the first portion already dropped there from one of the earlier held cars. Warm, not hot, faintly stale. The odor rises more clearly from quantity than it did from a tray sample. That often happens. A small handful can be argued over. A shallow mass of the same grain begins arguing for itself. The superintendent notices that you notice. He says, almost to himself, that no buyer would have thanked him later if this had gone unnoticed into sound stock. That sentence contains a great deal. Not only acceptance, but hindsight already beginning to rewrite the day. Men prefer, when they can, to tell themselves they would have wanted the right thing all along. Sometimes that is even true. Sometimes what they wanted was simply not to be the first to pay for it. A little later, on the upper platform, another car from the same route is cracked open under supervision. This one is mixed in condition. The top grain is less concerning. Lower down, near one corner, the odor returns. That result is almost more instructive than an obviously bad car. It shows why a compartmented trier exists in the first place. Surface grain can flatter a lot. The top dries first. The top cools first. The top tells the story that weather tells the eye. The lower body tells the story that transit tells the grain. You explain this to a clerk who has followed the inspection out of curiosity. He had thought, as many would, that sampling from the top should suffice on a busy day. You tell him that if the top always spoke for the whole car, your work would be much easier and much less necessary. He smiles faintly and says, "The market never pays men for easy truths." That may be the most direct thing anyone has said all day. With the new mixed condition sample, the case becomes more nuanced, but not weaker. The route is affected, yes, but unevenly. That supports caution over blanket language. It also supports your early decision not to condemn what had not been seen, only to hold it for seeing. Good inspection is often restraint in both directions. Not too fast to excuse. Not too fast to generalize. The clerk writes down your remarks, perhaps for no purpose beyond his own understanding. Even that is part of how forgotten trades survive a little longer, in one person's clearer idea of why another person's motions matter. Evening begins to gather in the unheated spaces first. The corridor between sample room and office cools again. The door glass reflects more lamplight than sky. Some of the day men have gone. The remaining staff move with the subdued concentration that comes when ordinary closing duties must be done around an extraordinary file. You return to the sample room to put the last comparison notes in order. The bench is crowded now with the residue of exactness. Open ledger, blotter stained with fresh ink, twine clippings. A chipped enamel pan still holding a few rejected kernels from one reduction. You brush the loose kernels into a labeled dish because even scraps left on a bench need a place once a day has turned official. Then you square the papers again, not trusting neatness unless you have made it with your own hands. The habit is old by then, older than this morning, older than this particular run of wheat from the western part of the state. In rooms like this, a man does not finish a task when he feels finished. He finishes when the desk could explain him after he has gone home. The office clock beyond the corridor gives a flat little tick that seems louder now that the callers have mostly stopped. It is near the hour when the market loosens its collar. Not closed, not asleep, but less crowded with argument. That is often when the grain inspector does some of his most trustworthy work. The hurry has thinned. The room can be read again. You take the latest house sample, the one from the newly opened car with the stronger odor, and spread it out one last time under the lamp. Warm grain behaves differently in the hand than cool grain. Not warmer by much, just enough that the palms know it before the mind arranges the fact into words. You let it run between thumb and fingers, and watch how the broken bits hang together for a breath before falling apart. That little hesitation in the flow would mean almost nothing to someone passing by. To you, after a full day of comparisons, it means the morning call has moved from suspicion to pattern, and from pattern to practical proof. The superintendent sends down a note in pencil, folded once, asking whether he should treat the remaining late arrivals from the same route as held on site until sampled. You read it twice before answering, because the wording matters even in a penciled exchange. If you say yes too broadly, you create a blanket presumption the file may not support. If you say no too loosely, you invite another avoidable blend. So you write back that all late cars from the same loading run should be sampled before ordinary unloading, and segregated if similar condition appears. That sentence will cost somebody another hour of labor. It may also save a week of regret. The note goes back up with the office boy, who by now walks more carefully than he did at dawn. He has been near enough to the day's trouble to understand, at least in outline, that papers can alter the movement of very large things. Outside, evening freight sounds carried differently. The yard is less full of shouted numbers, more full of couplings, brakes, and the hollow resonant knocks that drift from car to car, as if the whole line was settling into itself. From the riverside comes damp air through a cracked window frame. It softens the room and sharpens the smell of grain at the same time. You sit with the ledger and begin the final local entries for the day. This is not the glamorous part, if any part could be called that. It is the reducing of a long contested chain of events into lines that will look calm tomorrow. Date, arrival route, cars examined, condition observed, certificates issued, appeal prepared, segregation advised, clerical correction entered and initialed. There is a strange comfort in that compression. The day itself had pauses, pressure, faces at the door, questions asked in careful voices, and one or two moments when the whole thing might have gone softer if you had been a softer man. The ledger does not carry any of that mood. It carries only the skeleton. And skeletons are what archives remember best. A little later, the chief steps into the sample room without knocking, as men do when they have shared enough seasons of work to know where each other will stand. He has taken off his coat at last. That, more than the clock, tells you the day is entering its last labor. He asks whether the local file is complete for any inquiry that may arrive before appeal review comes back. You tell him it is nearly there. Then he asks the sort of question that is half practical and half philosophical in these offices. If the higher review softens the grade, what do you think it will soften on? Not the odor, you say, not the repeated condition. Possibly the weight given to how far condition should lower the lot under present market handling. He nods, because that is a fair answer. Appeals do not always deny what a man saw. Sometimes they simply disagree on what the standards ought to call it once seen. That is one reason the job rarely makes heroes of anyone. Even a correct local judgment may later be translated into slightly different official language by another desk, another region, another set of eyes, under another window. He says the market men are already preparing themselves to remember the day as an overcautious delay, unless the appeal confirms the full assessment. You say they may do that either way. He gives a small, tired smile. Then he says, that is why records exist, not to win admiration, only to outlast convenient memory. He leaves you with the folder and the faint smell of tobacco from his jacket, and the room becomes yours again. A grain inspector spends a great deal of time alone in company. All day men pass through, speak, object, ask, retreat. Still, the essential acts happen with only grain, paper, and your own restraint present to witness them. You open the sample cabinet and check the shelves one more time. Each retained sack has its place. Morning lots on one side, appeal portions removed and noted, late samples grouped by route, rejected scraps discarded, reference materials set back where another hand could find them tomorrow without hearing the whole story first. That last part matters more than it sounds. Work like this has to remain legible from shift to shift. No office can depend on one man's memory, because memory ages, and sometimes transfers, and sometimes simply fails after supper. The cabinet smells dry and papery, with a low, sweet undertone from old grain dust worked into its wood over years. You close the door gently and test the latch. Then you write the cabinet line in the ledger. Samples stored, cabinet secured. That is all. 4 words to represent a day's worth of vigilance. And as the first true evening settles over Omaha, another note arrives from the house. One more car from the western run has been opened enough for a quick check. The foreman reports less odor than the others, but an uneven heaviness in the lower drawer. He asks whether a full local certificate must wait until morning, or whether the car can be directed to temporary hold overnight. You put on your coat again. A man in this line cannot answer that kind of question from the bench if the car is still there to be seen. So you take the lamp and go back through the corridor, out toward the elevator floor, and into a world that has become more shadow than structure. The house at evening is a different building from the one at noon. By daylight it is boards, shafts, belts, bins, ladders, and men crossing practical distances. At night it becomes sound first, shape second. You hear the cups lifting in the leg, you hear grain rushing in a chute somewhere behind a wall. You hear the quick small impacts of kernels hitting metal and wood in places the eye cannot follow. The foreman meets you by the temporary hold track and lifts the lantern slightly in greeting. He is tired in the ordinary way working men are tired late in the day. Not defeated, just used. He says this car is not as far gone. That phrase is plain and useful. It leaves room for degrees. You climb the side ladder and take the drawer yourself. The grain is cooler than the stronger lot from earlier, yet not fully right. Its odor is less advanced, but the lower portion has the same slight inward sweetness that marked the morning samples. Not every car in a troubled run announces itself with equal force. That is why standards had to be built for repetition and comparison, not only for obvious defect. You tell the foreman to hold it overnight in the same segregated class, pending morning review. He asks if that means the railroad must leave the car spotted where it is. You say yes, unless another empty hold line is safer from a switching standpoint. He grunts softly and says they can manage one. Again, the day changes not by drama, but by men agreeing to practical inconveniences. You make the notation on your pad under lamplight. The paper gives a little under the pencil because the air is damp. Car examined after dusk. Condition similar but milder than strongest held lots. Temporary hold advised. Review at first light. The lantern smoke drifts once across the opening and then clears. Far off in the yard, a locomotive lets out a low, patient release of steam that sounds almost like a person settling into a chair. The foreman says he had thought at noon that the whole affair might still be office fuss over a faint smell. Then he saw the later car. That is often how these forgotten jobs prove themselves. Not in speeches, but in the arrival of the next thing. One more car, one more handful, one more gate not opened too soon. You walk back together part way, and he tells you how the bin floor had to be rearranged after the first segregation order. Men sent one way, then another, a cleaning run delayed. 2 compartments left empty that would otherwise be half full by now. He is not complaining. He is simply accounting. Every decision in grain becomes space and time before long. A lower grade is not just words on paper. It is feet of bin wall. It is waiting labor. It is a line of cars that do not yet become elevator grain. That physical side of grading is what most outsiders never see. They imagine quality as a number, or at most a price difference. But in a working house, quality decides where things can stand beside one another. It decides whether one flow of wheat may join another without risk. It decides whether the machinery works in the easy rhythm of routine or the stop and redirect rhythm of caution. Back in the sample room, you hang up the coat and put the lamp down. Your fingers smell faintly of metal, oil, and grain hulls. The ledger waits where you left it. So do the forms. So does the patient pile of local copies that must still be squared, arranged, and placed under the proper clip before anyone can honestly say the day is over. You eat the last of the bread from your pocket and drink water from a thick glass that has gone cloudy around the rim from use. No one in the public story of a market day imagines this part. The small, late hunger. The silence after the callers. The hand cramped from writing car numbers that all begin looking related in the same weak electric light. But these are as much a part of the profession as the standards themselves. Forgotten jobs are made not only of their official acts, but of the bodily ways a person carries those acts through time. A night janitor passes in the corridor and pauses to ask if the floor should be swept yet. You tell him not until you have finished with the desk. He nods, used to waiting around other men's exactness. Then he asks, because everyone in a building eventually wants the shape of unusual things, whether the Nebraska wheat was truly bad. You answer the way an inspector would. Not bad in the simple sense. Wrong enough to separate. He considers that, then says that sounds like much of life. It is not a joke exactly, more a tired observation, and because evening makes people a little more reflective than noon, the sentence stays with you after he moves on with his broom and quiet bucket. Wrong enough to separate, there is a great deal of grain work in those words. And perhaps some of the reason why no one remembers the inspectors for long. Their finest acts often amount to keeping unlike things from being made to pass as the same. You turn next to the duplicate copies. The carbons have to be checked for legibility. If one line struck poorly, the office receiving it tomorrow may misread what tonight's room understood perfectly. So you hold each page up to the light and study the weakest characters. A blurred station name, a numeral faint at the top. The lower loop of a letter in condition partly lost. Any of those can matter if an appeal clerk is tired or impatient. You take the typewritten original and, where office practice allows, reinforce one uncertain notation in ink with a careful hand initialed at the margin. No secret corrections. Nothing hidden. Only the visible maintenance of clarity. The forms are then sorted into their destinations: local office file, elevator copy, certificate register, pending appeal notation, house segregation reference. That last one is not always part of older routines, but on a day like this it helps bind physical handling to paper fact. If grain is held by condition, the house should not depend on memory alone to know why a bin was left half empty. The clock moves on, the room cools again in small ways. A draft at the ankle, a touch of chill in the steel edge of the scoop, the sense that the whole building is gently turning from day labor toward night custody. You are not the only one left, but the number of minds still occupied by this case has grown small. That, too, is how obscurity begins. A thing can occupy 15 men at 10 in the morning, and by 8 in the evening it belongs almost entirely to one or two. Tomorrow it will belong to fewer still. Then mostly to the file. When the chief returns once more, he carries a short telegraph acknowledgement from the office that will receive the appeal package. Expected on morning connection. Review to follow in order received. No promises. No judgment. Just the dry courtesy of administrative distance. You place the acknowledgement with the rest and note the time. He asks whether the late car has been locally held. You say yes, with review at first light. Then he says there is one more thing. A buyer from one of the firms has asked, informally, whether the held lots might be reoffered before appeal if sold into feed channels rather than milling. That is a real question, and not an unreasonable one. Different uses tolerate different condition to a point, but your answer must stay inside the proper lane. You say the local certificate stands for condition as received, whatever subsequent buyer or use may decide. Disposition after that belongs to the firms, not to the inspector, so long as handling and labeling remain honest. He nods. This is another subtle part of the role. A grain inspector influences commerce without becoming a merchant. If he began making trade judgments rather than condition judgments, the trust under him would thin very quickly. The chief says the buyer did not like that answer. You say he was not expected to. The chief gives that same brief, tired smile and says no, he was not. Then he leaves for the final time. The office beyond him is already dimmed. Typewriters covered. Stove banked low. One clerk finishing an envelope by lamplight. It is the sort of sight hardly anyone would preserve in memory unless he had lived years inside it. And yet whole regions depended on such rooms remaining orderly. You sit again and, because fatigue makes honesty more necessary rather than less, you reread your own earliest note from before sunrise. Cool in hand, slightly heavy, off odor suspected. Extra probes requested. The sentence has no flourish at all. Still, There is something almost moving in seeing how much of the day was already contained there. A great deal of skilled labor begins this way, not with certainty, with a disciplined willingness to let a small unease interrupt routine. Had you passed the first car as ordinary, the rest of the day would have been easier for everyone and worse for the wheat. That trade is at the center of many quiet occupations, to cause a little immediate inconvenience in order to prevent a larger hidden disorder later. No parade follows that choice, sometimes not even thanks. Mostly just paperwork and men walking different paths through a building because one person on one bench wrote down what he smelled. You copy the earliest note into the day summary, making sure the sequence can be understood without the private knowledge now living in your tired head. Morning anomaly noted, additional probing ordered, repeated condition observed across multiple cars. Provisional lower assessment entered. Chief informed. Certificate issued. Appeal samples prepared and dispatched. House segregation advised and confirmed by later stronger car. Late arrival held for morning review. There, a whole workday pressed into lines narrow enough to fit a folder. The janitor returns at last, and this time you let him sweep. He moves around your chair without impatience, drawing dust, hulls, and paper scraps into his pan with practiced strokes. Even his work has its own invisibility. Tomorrow men will walk in and feel the room ready again, and they will not think much about who made it so. That is one reason old industrial life can feel so tender when looked at closely. So many separate forms of care layered atop one another, each ordinary enough to disappear. He asks whether he may empty the reject pail. You tell him yes, but not the labeled dish. He says of course. Then he carries away the day's useless sweepings, and you watch the last light catch on the brew straw for just a second before it is gone into the corridor. You close the ledger, then open it again, because one date on the bottom line wants checking. This is how the job keeps itself honest. A man assumes he is done. Then he verifies. The date is right after all. Still, you are glad you looked. In another profession that might be called needless caution. Here it is simply the difference between a trustworthy file and an irritating one. The sample room feels larger once the bench is clear enough to see its surface. The tools go back in their order. Trier wiped down, divider brushed clean, scale balanced and covered, weights returned to their fitted places, grade cards stacked by size, fresh tags laid out for morning. The motions are almost as soothing as they were at dawn, though slower now. A broom put back into readiness says something kind to the part of a person that has spent all day holding lines. Nothing here is solved forever. Tomorrow there will be other cars, other smells, other arguments, perhaps milder, perhaps not. But for one evening, the tools can rest where they belong. Outside, river fog is beginning to make itself known in the yard. It does not rush in. It just thickens the dark at the windows and softens the sound of distant lights into small halos. Omaha near the river has that way about it in cold seasons. The city does not vanish. It simply withdraws a little behind damp air and smoke. You write one final house memo for the superintendent. Held lots remain segregated overnight. Late car to be resampled before ordinary unloading. No blending of Western run with sound reserve until local review complete. The note is left under the proper clip where the night foreman cannot miss it without trying very hard. Practical writing is often better than memorable writing. If a sentence directs labor correctly at 6 in the morning, it has done enough. For a moment, with no one speaking and only the distant machinery moving somewhere deeper in the building, you think about the scale of the trade beyond this room. Wheat cutting fields under a very different sky, loaded by men who may never see Omaha, telegraphed ahead in abbreviations, carried over rails through weather, sidings, delays, junctions, and handoffs, then finally stopped on one platform where a small steel tube and one person's senses decide whether the lot enters the market as expected or not. It is an intimate point in a very large machine, and because it is intimate, it is easy to forget. People remember locomotives. They remember grain prices. They remember wartime demand and harvest totals. They do not often remember the man who wrote condition concerns on a form at 9 in the morning and quietly altered where 50 or 60,000 pounds of wheat could go by dusk. The thought does not make you proud exactly. Pride is not the prevailing mood of such labor. Closer to steadiness. A sense of fitting into a structure that only works when each part accepts its own narrow truth. By night, that narrow truth is almost the only thing left that still feels solid. You gathered the last loose notes, and your thumb comes away grey with dust and carbon. The papers are light, but they carry the day better than memory will. A week from now, most of the men who stood in doorways this morning will remember only delay. A month from now, they may remember a damp western run and little else. Years from now, if anyone opens the file at all, they will meet typed lines before they meet a human face. That is the ordinary fate of this kind of work. It leaves records more easily than it leaves stories. Still, one more thing remains before you can lock the room. The local register has to receive the certificate number in its final place, and the held cars have to be entered against it, so no clerk tomorrow mistakes them for ordinary arrivals. You dip the pen, shake off the excess, and write slowly. Certificate number, route, cars affected, condition noted on arrival, appeal forwarded. Segregation in effect. The ink dries with a faint dull shine under the lamp. That line will outlast the smell in the room. It may outlast the building. Outside the window, a switching engine moves somewhere in the fog, unseen except for a mild pulse of light. You can hear the cars answer one another down the line, one knock, then another, then stillness. In Omaha, in the early 1940s, so much of commerce moves that way. Not in speeches, in impacts, notes, signatures, and pauses. The grain inspector belongs to the pauses. He is the person who keeps movement from pretending to be certainty. That is why so few people remember him. The world notices grain once it is flour, feed, or price. It notices trains when they are late. It notices shortages when shelves thin and abundance when bread is cheap. But the act of standing between arrival and acceptance, of saying this lot is not the same as that lot, is too quiet to stay in public memory for long. Even on a day like this, when your decision has changed the use of bins, the timing of labor, the wording of contracts, and the route of an appeal package heading east in the morning, almost no one beyond the trade will ever hear about it. And among those in the trade, the attention will settle not on your name, but on the lot itself. Men will say, later, that there was that Nebraska wheat with the condition trouble. They will say one elevator had to keep space clear. They will say the certificate came in lower than expected. They may even remember that the appeal took some days, but the inspector will recede into the grammar of the file. Inspector observed, inspector noted, inspector certified, no first name needed, no voice preserved, only the function doing what it was there to do. You place the ledger back on its shelf. Then you take the key for the sample cabinet, fit it into the lock, and turn it until the little bolt catches with a soft metal click. The retained sacks are inside now, neat and numbered, each one holding a fragment of the day's argument. One bag smells almost clean. One carries the faint, stale sweetness from the first suspicious drawer. One from the stronger car opened in the evening still gives off that warmer, feed-like note that turned the superintendent practical at last. Tomorrow, if needed, those sacks can speak again. Tonight they sleep in a dark cabinet, and that, too, feels fitting. Evidence in this world spends a great deal of time in quiet places. The floorboards creak once, as the janitor passes again at the far end of the corridor. A door shuts somewhere upstairs. Then the building seems to settle onto its own bones. You put on your coat more carefully this time, not because the cold is worse, but because the body has finally begun to feel the day it carried. A grain inspector's fatigue is not spectacular. It lives in the fingers, in the eyes, in the neck, and in the part of the mind that has spent hours refusing approximation. You blow out one lamp, then another. The room dims, but does not disappear. The last light from the corridor still finds the edge of the scale cover, the row of tags for morning, the corner of the grading board worn smooth by years of grain dragged under steady hands. For a moment you stand there and look, not sentimentally, only to confirm that everything is where it should be. The tools are at rest, the forms are stacked, the samples are secured. The room could explain itself if asked. That is enough. When you step outside, the river fog has thickened. It lies low along the yard, turning lamps into pale circles and swallowing the far end of the tracks. The elevator house behind you is still alive with reduced machinery. Not the full-day rhythm now, but the guarded after-hours pulse of a place that never entirely stops listening to what it stores. A night man raises one hand from the platform as you pass. He does not ask for a summary. He only wants to know, with that one glance, whether the held grain remains held. You nod. He nods back. That is the whole exchange. In quiet industries, whole responsibilities can be transferred in less than a sentence. You walk along the boards beside the track and feel damp gathering at the cuffs of your trousers. The smell out here is different from the sample room. Coal smoke, wet timber, cold iron, the sweet, dusty breath from the elevator vents, thinning into the fog. Somewhere across the yard, a clerk is still finishing a waybill. Somewhere else, a foreman is making sure the wrong gate stays shut until morning review. And in one office, under a clip or in a drawer, the certificate lies flat and ordinary, though it has already altered the shape of tomorrow. That is the strange proportion of this job. Small marks, large consequences. No audience. As you near the gate, the day begins reducing itself in your mind, the way grain is reduced through the divider until only a fair portion remains. The first cool sample before dawn. The deeper draws. The off odor that could have been denied if met only once. The second car. Then the third. The chief's one word, enough. The certificate issued. The appeal prepared. The mistaken digit repaired before it could become suspicion. The later car in the house, warmer and more advanced, proving that caution had arrived before trouble spread. Nothing in that chain would look dramatic on a poster, yet each part leaned on the next. That is how so many invisible occupations matter, not by grand moments, but by sequences that do not break. At the gate, you sign out with the watchman. He keeps a small notebook and a blunt pencil, and he writes your time in a hand that makes every man equal. In, out. No one is impressive in a gate book. That may be another reason such work feels honest. He asks whether you'll be back before sunrise. You say yes, because the late held car needs first light review, and the appeal acknowledgement may bring follow-up. He says he thought so. Then he tears a corner from yesterday's newspaper to light his pipe, shielding the match from the damp. The flare is brief. Then only the smell remains, mild and familiar. You start toward the street, and the boards give way to pavement under your shoes. Omaha beyond the yards is quieter now. A truck rolls slowly past, loaded but covered. A street lamp hums. Farther off, there are homes with suppers finished, dishes drying, radios low in warm rooms where no one is thinking about grain standards. And perhaps that is as it should be. Most people are able to sleep because other people spent the day making unnoticed distinctions. The flour is sound because someone checked what arrived. The ledger balances because someone corrected one wrong pair of digits. The better wheat remains better because someone kept it separate from the lot that asked to be overlooked. Such acts do not invite remembrance. They invite continuity. And continuity, when it works, is almost always mistaken for nature. Tomorrow may soften the day or sharpen it. The higher office may confirm the lower grade exactly. It may affirm the condition and alter the final language by a degree. A buyer may continue pressing. A shipper may insist the route, not the grain, deserves blame. A file may thicken, then in time it may go still. That uncertainty is part of the profession too. A man rarely gets to place the last word on his own judgment. He places the cleanest word he can, then hands it forward. You turn once, at the corner, and look back through the fog. The elevator lights are dimmer now. The sample room itself cannot be seen from here. It is only one section of wall among many, one hidden chamber inside a larger working shape. No passerby would guess what happened there today. No headline will preserve it. No plaque will mention that on this damp evening in the 1940s, a grain inspector in Omaha kept a questionable run from disappearing into ordinary storage by refusing to hurry when the first handful felt wrong. The result of his care is, in a way, that almost nothing visible happened at all. A blend did not occur, a bin did not sour. A later dispute may stay smaller than it would have been. That is the kind of success history rarely knows how to hold. It prefers visible outcomes. Quiet prevention leaves only thin traces. A file, a certificate, a few altered notations in ledgers. And then, after enough years, even those become paper sleeping in boxes. But tonight, the traces are still fresh. The grain is still segregated. The late car is still waiting. The appeal package is still tied and sealed for the morning connection. The office copy is still drying in its folder. And you, for one more hour before sleep, are still the man who knows exactly why those things are so. That knowledge will fade in its own time. Even your own memory of the room will smooth at the edges. The exact smell of the first sample may go first, then the order of who stood in the doorway and when. Then the particular sound the typewriter made when the certificate line struck the paper. What remains, if anything remains, will be simpler. A sense of a cold bench before dawn, a run of cars from the west. A day when caution had to be maintained all the way into evening. And perhaps the feeling, more than the facts, that a person's whole usefulness can sometimes consist in noticing one small, honest difference and refusing to let anyone talk it away. You walk on. The fog takes the yard behind you. The rail sounds soften. The street opens ahead, plain and dark. Back in the sample room, the scales are covered. The trier is clean. The ledger is shut. Behind the cabinet door, the little sacks wait in order.